Okay, well, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this morning for our row crop grower meeting. I think we've got a really good lineup of speakers this morning for you, so you'll be able to take away a new tidbit of information at the very least this morning. Before we get rolling though, a few housekeeping items. This meeting will be recorded, so if you were unable to join us this morning for whatever reason, it will be uploaded to YouTube later on for you to view. Now, you will have noticed that as you came into the meeting, we have you muted. Please take this as a reminder too, to ensure that because our meeting is recorded, to turn off your camera. So unless you want to be a part of our video, just turn off your cameras. Now, you will notice there is a chat function on Zoom. So we're going to be asking anyone who has questions to please use the chat function to type in your questions. And after each speaker, we will go through and check the chat to see if there are any questions that need to be answered. With that, I think we will get things started. Now, our first speaker is Lakeside's very own Dave Curry. And Dave's one of the agronomists that works out of the forest branch. And today, Dave's going to be walking us through variable rate scripting, start to finish, and how it fits on your farm. So take it away, Dave.
All right, just going to get my screen shared here. You guys seeing everything nicely?
Yep.
Perfect. All right, yeah, good morning, guys. So as Anita said, I'm Dave Curry, one of the agronomists working out of the forest office at Lakeside. And I thought I would discuss a topic that I'm pretty interested in, and that's variable rate fertility. So I've kind of labeled this presentation Variable Rate Fertility at Lakeside from start to finish. And I'll walk through some of the steps that we take to build a variable rate plan. Just a bit about myself. I graduated from the University of Western Ontario in 2010 with a degree in biology and plant science. And then I got my CCA in 2012 and followed it up with my 4R nutrient stewardship in 2016. And the wife, kids, and I live in the village of Kamlaki. So it's in between Sarnia and Forest at the southern end of Lake Huron. And I started with Lakeside back in 2019, and I haven't looked back. In the past, I've worked for 2 different large ag cooperatives, and I would say that Lakeside's abilities when it comes to fertilizer is the best in the industry. So these 2 girls here keep me motivated every day to work hard. I try to take them out as much as possible when I'm out crop scouting. Brooklyn here wants to be a vet when she grows up, and Gwen wants to be an optometrist, but I'm still going to try to brainwash them to get into agronomy because it's an awesome job. So I threw this slide up to reinforce the idea of the 4R nutrient stewardship program and how variable rate fertility is a key part of 4Rs. And, you know, it's all about that right source, right rate, right time, and right place, and about reallocating nutrients to where they're actually needed in the field. And when we talk about 4Rs and fertilizer, there's a lot of discussion on phosphorus and phosphorus loading into the Great Lakes. And I put this picture up because of the significance of its location. You know, we are called Lakeside for a reason, because we are near the Great Lakes, and it's where we all call home. And we need to protect our waterways. So this image here is just showing the last big algae bloom in the western basin of Lake Erie. And, you know, the Maumee River in Ohio dumps most of the phosphorus into, or has the biggest contribution for phosphorus loading, but Ontario is still a source. And, you know, we need to be mindful that the public is somewhat pointing fingers at us in agriculture and the fertilizer world. And potentially the government may limit some of our uses. And hopefully variable rate is going to help us delay that. So just a little blurb about Lakeside. At Lakeside, you know, we are focused and geared towards being the leading progressive retailer in southwestern Ontario in the ag space. And, you know, the future of farming's here. Technological advances have come leaps and bounds in the last few decades, and definitely in the last decade in my career. Some of these precision agricultural theories, you know, they're no longer pie in the sky ideas and we can actually implement them in real time. And, at Lakeside, we believe we have the best and most knowledgeable team in the region. We have the equipment and technology to make precision ag happen. And our newest equipment is dialed in to implement our agronomic recommendations. So this is just a snapshot of our retail locations at Lakeside. So we've got Forest, Petrolia, and Melbourne, and we have 2 fertilizer blending facilities, as you may know, one in Forest and one in Melbourne. And, we pride ourselves on having excellent on-time delivery from our extensive trucking fleet, and it's made us able to service quite a large area. And Lakeside covers off Lambton, Middlesex, and Kent counties. So at Lakeside, we aren't in this alone. Not only do we have great internal staff, but we also have partners to call on and experts in the precision ag field that we have strategic relationships with. And this team, on the screen here is some of the team that's helping us drive our variable rate business at a great pace. Yeah, so in this presentation, I wanted to focus on how we at Lakeside should be your main partner when it comes to variable rate fertility and precision ag. And, I'd like to touch on a few topics like field variability and how we can identify it, discuss on how we can create management zones. So whether we have yield data to work with, or we're using our satellite imagery software, soil sampling with Lakeside also, and then how we build fertility recs and the science that goes behind it. So this will involve setting those long-term targets, looking at crop removal and amortized build programs. And then, we followed it up with in-field ground truthing and scouting of the crop, and potentially some in-season tissue sampling and soil sampling. And then finally, how do we put it all into action, that variable rate prescription? So field variability. Variability, the definition is the lack of consistency or a fixed pattern. And variable rate prescription, or VRX, it's all about applying fertility based on that GIS location in the field. And, soils are variable, and really each acre almost should be treated differently. And we need to move away from this one rate across the entire field and kind of narrow it down to the acre. Just kind of a neat picture I snagged off the web. It's an old 1970s map of Lambton County, a soil survey, and just wanted to point out how, at Lakeside, in our geography that we spread fertilizer on, we're dealing with all kinds of different soil types. So, all fields have variability, whether it's topographic, so highs and lows in the fields, soil textures. I've seen fields with sands, clays, and mucks all in the same field. It could also be field history that's aiding into variability. So that could be rotation, could be a former pasture that's been incorporated into the main field, fence rows that have been cleaned up, and joining of parcels. So, there are lots and lots of things that contribute to variability. And I'd say, when we see soil tests coming back, we rarely see a uniform test across the field. So again, our game plan, we're trying to narrow that scope from the field down to the acre. And a big part of this that we're looking at now is developing these management zones. And management zones are kind of that next step beyond the standard grid pattern. So a grid is an excellent starting base. We just maybe want to move past that. And so, these management zones, they're going to vary in size from maybe down to 1 acre up to 10 acres potentially. And again, they're based on soil type, crop rotation, manure history, elevation. So having these detailed management zones, it's going to allow us to precisely apply those crop nutrients to where they're actually needed. And, the crop gives us very detailed maps of field variability. And whether that's, harvest yield maps from a combine or in-season vegetative imagery from a satellite, we get data in and it'll equal data out. And, the more detailed the data we're getting, yield maps or imagery, the better the resulting recommendation from us will be. Yeah, so, combine yield monitors, they work great. It's an excellent source of data. Even if they're not calibrated bang on, it's still at least relative across the entire field. And the data is very detailed and precise. We can then export that onto a stick or wirelessly move it into a software we can work with, such as our Cirrus program, My John Deere, or Fieldvue. This here is just an example of a wheat field, an image that was taken off Fieldvue, Climate Fieldvue. And, you can see pretty good yields across the board on this farm. However, there is a pocket that's well below the average yield for the farm. And, knowing the history of this farm, that's a real sandy ridge that flows through this field. So likely this area should be managed differently than the high yielding zones. Now, it's not the end of the world if a farmer doesn't have a yield monitor or yield data. We can use and utilize satellite software to get kind of a rough idea on field variability. It's not as detailed, but it gets us pretty close. So I just threw up an image here of a side-by-side of a yield map from a combine of a soybean field and the in-season kind of peak vegetative image from that same bean field, and just comparing, in the poor yielding zones here, you can see that it correlates to lower imagery, right, and a little less potential yield. And same with the the higher yielding zones are also a bit darker greener. So again, we can work with this data. For imagery, like everyone in the industry, we're using a normalized difference vegetation index for NDVI. And that NDVI is the measured difference between near infrared light, which the crop reflects, and red light, which the crop absorbs. So crop vegetation, which is high in chlorophyll, generally reflects more NIR and green light, and that's kind of why we see plants as green. So having a greater NDVI means more crop canopy and potentially better yield. So it's a better zone that can be managed differently. We are using the Sentinel-2 satellite clusters, and they give us a pretty good resolution. So it's down to about 10 meters or 30 feet. And it's data that we could export and work with. So this is just an example of an image that I would get through our Cirrus program. Climate Fieldvue also produces some excellent images as well. So this field has some pretty significant variability. You can see the NDVI range down sub 0.5 all the way up to about 0.8. And again, based on, in my mind, I know the farm, I know the soil type, and there's quite a ridge of soil that goes through this farm. So on the southeast part of the farm, we have a lower yield potential area that's a little heavier clay, and it's showing up with a lower NDVI. And the better loamier parts of the field are showing up with a higher NDVI, which makes sense. So just kind of a side note, certain things we can use for our imagery as well. We can make ourselves a little bit more efficient when we're out scouting based on an image. So we can go out and walk to 2 different zones in the field, scout the good versus poor areas, and potentially pull a tissue sample or a soil sample, and that might lead to an immediate action plan. Potentially that's a foliar fertilizer, or in this case, the farmer went out and top dressed some ammonium sulfate to correct a sulfur deficiency, or it might help us generate a plan for next year and make some recs. So yeah, back to our NDVI image. We can create scripts based on these NDVI images. If that's all we have to work with, at least it's a starting point. So I can take that image and I can now make, based on that image, 5 different management zones. So I'm going to assign now a fertilizer rate based on that management zone or that yield potential in the field. So, the lower yielding part of the farm might not need as much fertilizer because it's generally not pulling as much away out of the soil. And whereas the high yielding zones should have a higher rate of fertility. So, this is what we would use if we're going in blind without a soil test. And that kind of leads me into soil sampling, and hopefully maybe this fancy rig here will be in the Lakeside budget in the next few years, but we'll see. Currently, some of the labs we're working with, they have these great hydraulic samplers mounted to their soil sampling rigs. And they're able to punch down and grab that perfect 6-inch core out of the soil. So your results, your data is very uniform and consistent. It's not like taking a shovel and just jamming it in, or even with the probe where you're not always bang on 6 inches. And because at the end of the day, soil testing is key. And for us to develop a variable rate recommendation or a script, we need good soil data. These composite samples of 25 acres per bag really won't cut it, because it's too wide of an area and it doesn't have enough resolution. So ideally looking at a 2.5 acre sample on a grid or management zone sampling is going to be the way to go. And, because it all starts with that soil test to build the recommendation. And I kind of make that analogy that the soil test is like the field's blood sample, and we need as much data as possible. So here's just an example of points pulled from the soil sampling rig on a 2.5 acre pattern. So they would have gone out and each individual point grabbed probably 10 cords, mixed them in the bag in that 2.5 acre pattern. Grabbed about 32 bags of soil off this field, and it gave us very detailed results. Just on my my little test farm there, throwing up that 2.5 acre grid. It's nice, and it's a great start for soil sampling, and obviously a much more detailed approach than pulling 2 bags off this farm, and it's going to help us generate that script. However, when we have images like this, we can potentially sample in zones. So we could look at sampling this high yield potential green area separately from the lower yielding orange and red areas. And I just wanted to show the example here. When you throw your grid over top of your NDVI map, or if you used a yield map, that would work as well. You can see how there are going to be 2.5 acre grids that are going to have multiple yield zones in that 2.5 acre grid. So when you mix those in a bag, that might completely throw off the resulting sample. Like in this area, we've got a low yielding area that would be mixed in with the high yielding area, and it's going to give us an average. That's not going to be bang on to what the soil actually needs. So we got our test back from the lab. And here's just an example of a soil test where we're addressing multiple factors. So we have very low phosphorus numbers. We also have lower calcium, but we also have low pH. And, before we spread phosphorus, we need to address pH. We generally use the buffer pH number to calculate our lime needs. And that's because buffer pH, it's a measure of the soil's total acidity or lime requirements. And if it's the lower the buffer pH, the more the soil will resist that pH change, and then you're going to require a little bit more lime to raise that soil pH. So you can calculate based on our buffer pH, our soil pH, and then our target soil pH, the amount of pounds or tons per acre that we're going to require. I've heard this saying from a few soil gurus over the years, that the first dime of fertility is spent on lime. And essentially that's saying that if your pH is out to lunch, then the first item to address on a soil test is pH. So, if you're in that acidic zone, you need to correct the pH first, because most nutrients are highly available and most available in this 6.2 to 7.3 pH zone. And if we dive into a low pH, things like phosphorus become quite unavailable for the crop. So, depending on our soil test, we're going to recommend either if it's a soil that's low pH and low in calcium only, we're going to look at calcitic lime. But if it's also a magnesium calcium issue, then we're going to look at dolomitic lime as our lime source. And with lime spreading, variable rate has a huge fit. And generally the rates required across a field will differ dramatically, but depending on the zones or even the acre. So if you guys are getting soil tests back that are low pH, it's well worth investing the time to grid sample or zone sample that field. This is just a cool map I grabbed off Omafer's website, showing some of the areas in our territory that have low pH or pH challenges. That slightly acidic zone is kind of the sweet spot. But when we get into the medium acidic areas, that's where it needs to be generally addressed with lime. So you can see, Lakeside up here, we've got the Melbourne crew down in this area. So there is quite an area from Strathroy down to Bothwell that has to be addressed with lime and has pH issues. So enough on pH, and on to phosphorus, because I really think phosphorus drives the bus on variable rate. It's an extremely important nutrient when it comes to 4R nutrient stewardship. And again, I'm hammering on this, but we do expect that likely the government down the road here is going to put more regulations on Ontario farmers when it comes to spreading phosphorus. Yet in general, from the soil tests I see, they're usually coming back low in phosphorus and below that optimal number. So it's not like farmers are even excessively spreading phosphorus. And we know we need to spread phosphorus to grow crops. It's a key nutrient in high yield production. So onto our phosphorus soil test. When we look at our soil test for phosphorus, we generally look at the sodium bicarb number. It's also known as the Olsen number, and that's kind of the standard for Ontario, because it works best in the pH range of 6 to 8, which most our soils are in. OMAFRA will set that target of 20 to 25 ppm on the sodium bicarb. And I just wanted to make note, it takes, about 35 pounds of P2O5 to build 1 ppm on that bicarb number. So A&L Labs, this is an example of kind of their phosphorus recommendations. They generally are a little bit on the higher end for phosphorus recs. So, in general, they're 25 to 35 might get them in the sweet spot. So for me, I like to maybe be at the high end of OMAFRA and the lower end on A&L as my general recommendation. And it will vary based on soil type and CEC. Just wanted to show here, so that field we pulled those grid samples off on the bicarb number. It was kind of one of those fields, if you went out and walked the farm, you'd stand there and say, this is your typical Lambton clay. There's no variability. It's flat. But yet you look at the phosphorus numbers that came back, and there's some pretty extreme variability. We've got lows in the field down to 14 ppm all the way up to 30 in this main field. And I take the small fields out. They weren't farmed the same. And the other thing A&L will show us too is the percent phosphorus. And it kind of tells us what's actually available to the crop. And percent phosphorus, it'll take into account the CEC, so that cation exchange capacity or the soil type. So as you go higher in CEC, you generally have more clay content. And it also takes into account at low pH aluminum tie-up of phosphorus and at high pH calcium tie-up for phosphorus. So sometimes it's worth looking at when making that recommendation, because ppms aren't always the driving factor. It's what's going to be available to the crop. And this is kind of a good example of that. So we have a soil test here with a 19 ppm on the bicarb. So a little bit below that optimal range, but not terrible. And then if you look here at the percent phosphorus as a 6, they're calling it a medium. So it's actually fairly decent. A little bit low on the main phosphorus, but what's available to the crop is decent. So, we might target this as a 25 ppm as the target. Comparatively, this is a soil test here with, the same sodium bicarb number of 19 ppm. Yet when you look at the percent phosphorus, what's actually available to the crop, it's considered very low. So it's actually, in my mind, this soil is a lot more hungry for phosphorus based on that soil test. I might make a target on this one of 35 ppm. So again, it's important to look at percent P when making that recommendation. I threw this slide in because I really like the imagery we're getting. Today, we've got very good detailed images, whether it's coming from our Cirrus program or from Climate Fieldvue. They're pretty cool to look at, and we seem to get all kinds of images through the season. So I just threw up here the peak vegetative image for this wheat field where I thought it would have the most biomass, so probably mid-June, and compared it to that percent phosphorus test. And I think there is a little bit of a trend here. You can see in the lower yield potential zones, we do have lower percent phosphorus, and in some of the higher yield potential zones, we've got higher phosphorus numbers. And we know wheat responds to phosphorus, so this makes a lot of sense. Okay, so after reviewing our soil tests, we can come up with a fertilizer recommendation. So some of the things that need to be considered, we need to look at yield goals when we're establishing kind of those crop removals for the rotation, whether it's a single year broadcast or single crop broadcast or a multi-crop broadcast. And then we need to establish kind of a timeline for building our soil. So is that a 1-year build? Is it a 2-year build or a 3-year build? And then, what is that soil test goal? So in this example, we had our 19 ppm, and maybe I'll use that first soil test, and a goal of 25 ppm. So I'm looking at a 2-year crop removal for phosphorus only, because I'm just focusing on phosphorus. Corn at 220 bushels, beans at 60 bushels. So in 2 years, the grain alone is going to take 127 pounds of P2O5 away from the soil, which is about 245 pounds of MAP. So that's just my crop removal, my maintenance. So this would be an example of how we would calculate buildup and maintenance. So we've got a soil test target of 25 ppm, and I took this off OMAFR's publication, so anyway, so we've got the soil test target of 25 ppm, and we're starting at 19 ppm. So, that's a difference of 6 points that we need to build. And we know it takes about 35 pounds of P2O5 to move that needle by 1 ppm. And, we're going to amortize this over 2 years. So we're going to spread again before the next corn crop. So it's really 4 years because it's a corn beans, then corn beans, and we're only spreading every 2 years. So it makes it a bit confusing, but the math does work. So we're able to calculate our buildup needs, and then we add our crop maintenance or crop removal that we calculated in the last sheet, and it spits out our recommended rate of 232 pounds of P2O5 required to build that soil long term. It's going to have to be spread twice over the next 4 years. So that's 445 pounds of MAP. So we can then take this equation and we can plug it into each individual zone in a spreadsheet for each individual management zone, or based on the grid sample, and come up with a script. So here's just an example of a script that we did for that field. So this one was based on, again, those 2.5 acre grids, and we set the average rate as pretty much crop removal for that farmer when we included his starter program as well. But there is a bit of a rate range of 75 pounds on the minimum up to 200. And that's all we felt comfortable with. We didn't want to cut back to 0. And we're going to do this over the course of a few years. But we were only looking at 1 year's crop removal this year. And essentially, we're out there spreading the nutrients based on the soil test needs. And then we're able to load that script with our My John Deere program wirelessly into our machine, and get out there and apply those nutrients based on the 4 R's. So that rate, source, rate, time, and place. And hopefully, our customers have some big bin busting yields. Yeah, so that was just kind of a brief snapshot of some of the steps we go through at Lakeside to develop a variable rate fertilizer script. And I'd like to put a little sales plug in, reach out to any one of our staff to discuss lining up a field for soil sampling. There's still lots of time this spring to get sampling done before, the planters hit the field and get a script made. And, some final closing remarks from me. The team at Lakeside, we want to be your crop nutrition partners. We think we have the most expert knowledge in the industry. We have the equipment to also get it done. And, I want to say thanks and fingers crossed that we have a successful 2022 cropping season. That's all I got, guys. If there's any questions, you can throw her in the chat.
Awesome. Thanks for that, Dave. I'll maybe just give it a minute here to see if anyone's got some questions. Okay, it looks like the chat function is quiet for now, which means we will move on to our next speaker. So our next speaker is Mike Cobra, and Mike is one of Ontario's experts when it comes to all things herbicides and tough to control weeds. So with that, I will let Mike take it away.
Perfect, Anita. Thank you very much. Pleasure to be here today, and thanks to Dave in particular for the invite. So the story I'd like to tell this morning is to look at what field scenarios are likely to result in a maximum return on your herbicide investment by using residual herbicides in herbicide-tolerant soybeans. It's a practice that we're quite familiar with in corn. We see the value of residual herbicides. It's been a bit tougher to see that value in soybeans, although that has changed in the last 5 years. So I want to anchor our presentation first with the critical weed-free period, because that kind of defines our approach to what we do with weed control in soybeans. And really the critical period, we all know it, but it always helps to refresh it every year, is that soybean yield loss from weed competition is minimized if we can keep that crop weed-free from the first trifoliate stage of growth up into the third trifoliate stage of growth. So anything emerging prior to that first trifoliate stage is not likely to impact yield. And then anything emerging after the third trifoliate stage, again, not likely to impact yield, although there's value in managing weeds that emerge after this stage. From a seed return perspective, it minimizes the amount of seeds that we're returning to the soil. Now if we look back at weed removal timing studies in Ontario, they clearly show why that critical period has been defined. So, if we look at the turn of the century, the work that was done on herbicide tolerant soybeans, this is 9 trials at Elora and Woodstock, certainly there's tremendous value in removing weeds or weed control, right? We see like over 70% yield loss from doing nothing, basically, compared to when we keep the soybean crop weed free. But you'll notice that if we initiate control or weed removal at the first trifoliate stage, we are getting yields that are comparable to season-long weed control, right? But if we delay weed removal up until the end of that critical period, there's a 14% reduction in yield. And of course, there is a penalty also for being too early, although you could at least correct that. You can't get this back in terms of yield loss from weeds emerging during the critical weed-free period. Now, if we fast forward another 7 years, more weed removal timing studies were done in the province, this time out of the Ridgetown campus, University of Guelph, and we see similar trends. In this case, yield losses from weeds from doing nothing in around that 60% yield loss range. And if we initiate weed control at the first trifoliate stage, yields are comparable to our season-long weed-free check. And if we initiate control after the critical period, and in this case, at the 5th trifoliate stage, we see a 13% reduction in yield. So a pretty strong, firm data to support that critical weed-free period. Of course, just to throw a little bit more at you in terms of the variability, the most recent set of weed removal timing trials that were done kind of early 2010s, again by Ridgetown, showed that in these particular sites, weed yield losses from weed competition in around that maybe 40%, so not as detrimental, although clearly significant. And again, initiating weed removal at the beginning of the critical period gave us yields comparable to season-long weed control. In this case, though, delaying weed removal after the critical period only resulted in a 5% yield reduction. And so also, I think that, what this demonstrates is there is a range in impact, and I'll speculate on why that is. The anchor, though, is that we need to be, that crop needs to be weed-free at the beginning of the first trifoliate stage. Now, why we see a range, and part of this is speculative. I mean, it could be advancements in, more competitive soybean cultivars. I think more likely what goes on, though, is some things that Dave touched on, right? Like these particular sites in 2011, 2013 had tremendous soil fertility. And then also the weed populations were lower, not as many weeds, and the germination window was fairly small. So from a practical perspective on the farm, what's the data we need to maximize herbicide return, and then in particular the use of maybe soil residual herbicides? And that's to, clearly identify in each field what our weed emergence patterns are. And this is something you might have to hire out. You get a crop scout to do it. But if we can understand what the weed emergence patterns are from after planting until flowering, that really is powerful in terms of allowing us to prioritize which fields need attention sooner than others. And this is particularly beneficial if you have lots of acres to cover. I think, looking at the value of residual herbicides, we have to ask ourselves, are there resistant weeds that are a threat in your area, and particularly glyphosate resistant ones? So that's water hemp, or members of the pigweed family, Canada fleabane, or ragweed species. And then there's other benefits in terms of harvest efficiency. Do you battle those late season escapes, right? Like, it's not uncommon to see fields with crabgrass or foxtail that came up late in the season that are just a pain at harvest time. And then lastly, do you hire custom work? And the reason for that question is now you're introducing the possibility of bringing in maybe new species or resistant species that you didn't particularly have. Because what we're seeing lately is most of the resistant species aren't necessarily homegrown. They're introduced either by wind or by machinery or by animals or even flooding, right? So in terms of residual herbicides, here's been the conundrum. Like, the typical argument for why someone should add a residual herbicide to herbicide tolerant soybeans, it's kind of been two arguments, maybe one better than the other. But the first is it adds multiple modes of action, which reduce selection intensity for herbicide-resistant weeds, which is fine. That sounds noble. But the challenge is that it assumes that you can add multiple effective modes of action on every species in your field. So in other words, we have to have herbicides that provide the same level of weed control that glyphosate does on, a number of species. And frankly, that just doesn't really exist in the soybean herbicide landscape. I think probably a more reasonable argument is it takes the pressure off the timeliness of in-crop herbicide applications. So if you cover multiple acres over larger geographic areas, you have to be realistic and say, can I perfectly hit post-emergent applications of glyphosate at the first trifoliate stage in every single field? And if the answer to that is yes, then maybe residual herbicides aren't for you. If the answer is no, that's where it takes the pressure. You can be a little bit delayed and not suffer the consequences. So let's look at the historical impact on revenue from the inclusion of residual herbicides, because here's largely been, I think this clearly demonstrates why residual herbicides historically have not been adopted. So what you're seeing here is soybean yield in bushels per acre and different approaches to weed control. And so in this set of studies linked at Ridgetown campus, looking at weed removal, if we did a single glyphosate application at the first trifoliate stage, it maximized revenue. It provided great weed control, great yield, and at a very cost-effective price point. And so then the challenge is like when you start doing split applications of glyphosate, you weren't really adding much in the way of weed control. You were really only adding costs. So your revenue goes down. And then if we incorporate a soil applied herbicide, again, you're not really improving upon the level of weed control or yield versus just straight glyphosate. And so all you're really doing is adding herbicide costs. Although it is important to point out that, like, where you don't want to be, going back to the critical period, is super late with that single application of glyphosate. So if you're always going to be late, then there is the argument in this case that a residual herbicide would have been the lesser of the two options, right? Better to have residual than to be late. But, this is largely a snapshot of why, the adoption of residual herbicides has been tough to get your head around in soybeans. And so looking at another timing study by Dr. Sikkim at Ridgetown campus, again, here's just a different set of trials, similar end result in that the split application of glyphosate, so once at first trifoliate stage, once at fifth trifoliate stage, it gave the best level of weed control, the highest yields, and the highest return on investment. In this particular case, the number 2 solution was a residual herbicide followed by glyphosate. And of course, that's always better than being too late, or maybe only dealing with one pass when you have, again, maybe an emergence pattern of weeds that span over a long period of time. So again, knowing that information on a field by field basis allows you to kind of prioritize. All this to say, and I thought this was kind of a salient point in all these studies, is if you look at the high weed control efficacy, 90 to 100%, and yield benefits provided by the single or 2-pass sequential glyphosate programs, it makes it difficult to convince growers that it would be beneficial to include a pre-herbicide into their weed management program, especially considering the additional costs. So where does that take us today? Because things have changed dramatically over the last 5 years. And I'll present to you the most recent herbicide survey data in terms of use patterns in the province. And, as of 2020, close to 30% of all herbicide tolerant soybean acres now receive a pre-herbicide application. And that's up from basically nothing over 4 years ago. And largely the types of products now being used as pre-herbicides are these particular brands. So we see Sencor, which has a residual activity, Extendamax, Ingenia Classic, all herbicides with some level of residual activity. Aragon Liquid, of course, doesn't have residual activity. So what's driving this, and where is it having value? And so, to no surprise, it's particular weed species where we're struggling to get good control with kind of traditional products like glyphosate. And so the first significant driver would be water hemp. And again, what you're seeing on your screen here is a field in Norfolk County that had no history of water hemp at all. And it's speculated, although there's really no real way to tell for sure. This field is in a low-lying area surrounded by a river. This spring, it had flooded for a considerable period of time, and it's speculated that that's how the seed got there, which traditionally was how water hemp would infest fields. And so, yep, you now have a problem that you never had before. That problem comes, the data that we have in the province says that if you have water hemp in your field, it is over 95% probability that it's resistant to some herbicide. And even more alarmingly, there's a 25% chance that it's resistant to all the herbicides that traditionally would do a pretty good job on water hemp. So Roundup, things like Pursuit, Atrazine, or Sencor, and even Reflex. And there's a 50% probability it's resistant to kind of 3 of these. So all this to say is that there's a high level of resistance because this is a species that adapts to its environment very quickly. And so this changes the game, and it changes the perspective on the value of residual herbicides. And so if we look at the work that's been done recently by the University of Guelph Ridgetown campus, you need to be maximizing control of this species because it does germinate over a long period of time. It's super competitive. And what this particular chart is showing is soybean yield with different weed control programs. And this is the efficacy of water hemp 3 months after application. So I want to point out that these are all residual herbicide programs. But what is needed, because we have a species now that germinates over a huge window of time, is we need to layer residual herbicides in order to get over 90% control. So if we do a single application of Roundup Extend at the beginning of the critical weed-free period, traditionally that would have been more than enough. But because we have a species that germinates over a long period of time, that residual runs out of juice, and at the end of 3 months, we have about 71% control. To get us over 90% control, we either need to add that herbicide twice, right? An early post-application and a late post-application, or as we see at the top here, we either add a soil-applied herbicide like either Boundary, Fierce, or Authority Supreme, and then come back later post with another residual herbicide, in this case, Roundup Extend. And so that maximizes control. If we look at the revenue side of things, we lose the most money from just that single application approach, even with a residual herbicide, because we're not achieving great control. So this is flip the game, right? We're now not achieving excellent control with a single application of a particular herbicide. We need layered approaches. And so whether that's, and at this stage, in this particular set of trials, it was Boundary Liquid followed by Roundup Extend that maximized revenue, although all the other residual herbicides were in the ballpark. It really at that stage boils down to what is the cost of the program relative to the level of control. And they all provided excellent control. So it boils down to which one's the cheapest program. So things like water hemp, a huge game changer, and like making now residual herbicides a necessity in order to maximize revenue. And then you have things like Canada Fleabane, which, glyphosate resistant, fortunately doesn't germinate over a long period of time. It's relatively there in the early part of spring and doesn't have a huge germination window. So maybe residual herbicides aren't necessarily as important, but if we look at herbicides with residual activity like the dicamba products, whether that's in Ingenia, Fexapan, or Extendamax, we're clearly getting very good control of Canada Fleabane, or the combination of a contact herbicide like Aragon with a residual herbicide like Sencor, again, gives us excellent control of Canada Fleabane. And if we kind of break down those different burn down products with and without residual control in terms of cost and in terms of Canada Fleabane control, and this comes from work again done by Chris Budd, who is a graduate student out of the University of Guelph Ridgetown campus. You can see here that Aragon, so just a contact herbicide, gives us close to 90% control at a $21, $22 per acre price point. If we add another contact herbicide like 2,4-D ester, it increases our cost, but now we're over 95% control. However, what becomes interesting in my mind is for a fairly marginal increase in cost, about $10 an acre, we can add in additional residual herbicides, whether it be Sencor 75DF or dicamba. We get numerically better Fleabane control, but really good Fleabane control. And now we're adding residual control of other broadleaf species, and particularly ones that can be problematic for producers are lamb's quarters. And so soil applied herbicides also, although a necessity maybe for some of these herbicide resistant weeds, they provide value to other species like lamb's quarters. And so here's kind of the conundrum with lamb's quarters. And so what you're seeing on your screen here is, in the middle, we have a lamb's quarter plant sprayed with glyphosate. This is about 7 to 10 days after application. That's what we expect to see. We expect to see death. Now, On the right-hand side, you'll notice that that lamb's quarter plant is not dying. In fact, looks almost identical to the unsprayed lamb's quarters plant. And the only difference between these two plants was that we added a crop enhancer that contains a high portion of a divalent cation calcium. And the reason I show you this is that, of course, like, adding something like calcium to glyphosate clearly antagonizes. But in the natural environment, when we're looking at lamb's quarters, the same thing happens. So what I'd like to show in this chart here is that as lamb's quarters, and this is a study done in the US at 4 different populations in 4 states, but as lamb's quarters got bigger throughout the season, 1 inch tall to 3 inches tall to 6 inches tall, the level of calcium in the leaf of lamb's quarters increased by 500%. And so what that means practically is when you get large lamb's quarters, they have a higher level of calcium and they tie up more glyphosate, making it less effective. And if you think about a field environment where you don't have residual herbicides, there's always that conundrum where you have some lamb's quarters up and maybe they're at this 3-inch stage, but more are coming. So you maybe don't pull the trigger right away in terms of your in-crop application. And when you do, you have some that are large and then some that are small. But when you add in a residual herbicide, it does take out the majority of lamb's quarters, and those that do escape generally tend to be in kind of the same stage, making the in-crop herbicide application generally work better because the weeds aren't as big. And there has been a bunch of research done on that, most notably a study out of the US over almost 15 years ago that showed using a soil applied herbicide improved lamb's quarters control by over 30%, simply because you didn't have this massive range and size of lamb's quarters. The soil applied herbicide gave you a certain level of control. There were escapes, but you could manage those escapes much more uniformly, resulting in better control. And then the last point I'll leave you with on kind of the benefits of residual herbicides in herbicide tolerant soybeans is, what we're seeing in more fields is just these kind of late grass escapes. So what you're seeing on the screen here, this was applied with glyphosate within the critical weed-free period. All that simply happened, and it did a great job, but all that happened is there was, late season heavy rainfall that stimulated a bunch of, in this case, a bit of witchgrass and fall panicum very late in the season. And so as you got into kind of late July, it was starting to look pretty messy. Comparatively, if we went in at the late post-emergent stage with glyphosate in Zidua, a kind of a soil applied residual herbicide that now has a registration post-emergence in soys, it adds that little bit of residual activity later into the season that hopefully prevents that late flush of grassy weeds. And so it's kind of early days of seeing where the benefit of this fits, but that's becoming the challenge for some producers. Again, going back to scouting activities, is you have certain species that are germinating over a huge window of time. What kind of program can you build that introduces residual chemistry at maybe different stages to kind of prevent those late season escapes? So that's what I wanted to focus on today. That is kind of all that I had around the kind of residual aspect in soybeans. I think, if we look back even 10 years ago, it was tough to make the argument for residual herbicides in herbicide tolerant soybeans. I think there's a very good compelling argument and a necessity based on the species to use those products today. So at this stage, I will stop sharing my screen and I'll entertain any questions if there is some.
Wonderful. Thanks for that, Mike. That was really informative. Just checking the chat, and things seem to be quiet here. So we'll see if anything rolls in, but I've got Alrighty, I'm thinking we will get things rolling again here. So as everyone starts to trickle back in. And actually, you know what, before we do that, I see that there is a question that has popped up in the chat for Mike. So Mike, hopefully you're back or can hear this. The question is, what would you suggest for a progressive grower wanting to plant early soybeans, say around April, and doing a pre-program? I know from experience the Enlist program doesn't like cold temperatures that early, but on an extend or an IP growing platform.
Yeah, it's a good question. So a couple of things, like, yeah, like the herbicide tolerant technology does give you a certain level of improved crop safety on the active ingredients that it's tolerant to. I think, you know, I guess the real question is like, if we plant early, the chances are that seed is likely going to be sitting there a little bit longer than if we planted it mid-May, right? It's not going to pop up in 7 days. It's going to be under the soil. So do we do ourselves a disservice by, you know, throwing down soil applied herbicides at that stage as well? And the honest answer is, I don't know. That work hasn't been done. I think what you can, I imagine it's negligible, but what you could do to kind of mitigate any potential risk is maybe you delay, you know, if you were maybe going to do a pre-plant herbicide, maybe you do a, you know, post-plant but pre-emergence herbicide program, and you're not too fussed if it's a, you know, 2 or 3 or 4 days after planting, right? Like the necessity to be in there right away is not as great. So you can kind of maybe delay that pre-emergent herbicide to a little bit closer to when the soybeans come out of the ground. Although I admit that's a little bit playing with fire because we can't predict the weather. I think, you know, as I babble here and give kind of an incoherent answer, probably the salient point is I don't know of any evidence that would deter someone from just sticking to the normal course of action of putting down a soil applied program and worrying about cool weather. So I don't know, unless anyone has different experience, I think you kind of just stay the course, and if you're really concerned, then maybe you delay that pre-application to a bit later, but there's pros and cons of doing that too.
Perfect, thanks for that, Mike. We will keep going with our next speaker then. So the trio we have up next is Dave Robertson, Bob Thirlwall, and Leanne Freitag. Now, Dave, Bob, and Leanne are all a part of the team at Bayer Crop Sciences. With a wide portfolio, Bayer has something to offer every grower, whether it be seed, crop protection, or technology related.
Okay, can you hear me, Anita?
Yep, we can hear you, Bob.
Clear.
Okay, I'm just trying to share my screen here. Tell me when you can see my presenter view.
It doesn't look like I can see anything just yet, Bob.
Okay, we'll try this again. Oh, sure, there we go. That should work.
We're good now, Bob.
Perfect.
Get into my presenter view. There we go. Okay, great. Thank you. Well, thanks for the invitation here today to the Lakeside team. And my colleague Dave Robertson and I are going to go through some slides here on the crops update with crop protection and a little update on seed. And then Leanne Freitag is going to offer some thoughts on our Fieldvue portfolio as well. So I'm Bob Thirlwall. I'm the market development agronomist working with Lakeside. And our discussion today is Dave Curry had asked us to talk a little bit about where our seed crops are produced. So just a few slides on our corn and soybean production. I've got a quick update on a couple of traits we're introducing into the lineup. And then we'll talk about our new corn herbicides, Corvus and Lotus. And we'll finish up with Belero Complete for both corn soybeans and our new Bracero Pro T3 fungicide. So lots of new things coming from Bayer Crop Science right now on the crop protection side of it. And we're pretty excited to introduce some of these products to you today. So just a quick look at the Bayer Crop Science seed crop production. So Dave wanted me to introduce, talk about where our seed crops are produced. So the biotech traits really start in a lab in St. Louis. Some of them start in a petri dish, and then those crosses are made and turned into the corn and soybean seeds that we're familiar with. And one of the cool technologies that was developed about probably 10 or maybe 15 years ago was a machine called the seed chipper. And I got a couple of pictures here I wanted to show you, but it's really where it takes a small piece of that seed, either corn or soybean seed, and they take a little piece out of that kernel, and that small piece can be checked in the lab for biotech traits or agronomic attributes that we're looking for in those specific crosses. So whether it's SCN resistance or whether it's different BT proteins that we're trying to create. And the really unique part about this is that that actual seed is not destroyed. So if the seed contains the desired traits, it can be planted, and that's where that seed expansion process begins. So if we look at the actual picture of the seed chipper, this is technology that was designed by Monsanto engineers, like I said, 10 or 15 years ago, and where it actually takes a single individual seed on the right-hand picture there, and it holds it in position, and a small piece or a chip is taken out of that kernel for evaluation. And so the resultant seeds there, you can see just a little notch is taken out of that soybean seed or that corn kernel. And the seeds aren't actually thrown back in a bucket like this. They're put in individual cells so we can keep track of which seed those chips came out of, can evaluate those, and then again pick and choose which ones we want to keep and move into the seed expansion process. So kind of unique, pretty very unique engineering feat there to be able to analyze each individual seed and then still keep that seed so we can plant it out for propagation. As far as the Bayer breeding sites, the major breeding sites we have in St. Louis, Missouri. We have a breeding site in Hawaii, and then there's also a lot of work being done in Chile, and where we can send either for breeding purposes or actually for increased seed production, for commercial seed production in Chile that can be shipped back to Canada for the same planting season. So we would send seed down in the fall, in October timeframe, November, and then we could get that seed back in time for planting season the next spring. And we'll bring that home by plane if we're in a big hurry, or if we have time, we'll bring it home by boat. And all the seed that's commercially grown in Canada is basically, the corn seed is all produced in the Michigan area. Most of it's made in the Michigan area, Constantine, Michigan. We have a big corn plant there, and that's where about 70 to 80% of the seed production for Canada is grown. And then the balance of that corn seed, like I said, a tiny bit may come from Chile, but the balance may come from Remington, Indiana, and a couple of other locations in the U.S., but a lot of it's right from that Constantine, Michigan area. All of the seed production is 100% irrigated, so that really helps in getting consistent supply and good quality. We're taking that water portion out of the weather factor. It's all treated and packaged at those sites, and then shipped to our Tillsonburg warehouse. We have a central warehouse in Tillsonburg where all the corn comes into, and then it's shipped out to the local dealers such as Lakeside from there. And so soybeans quite a bit different. 100% of the seed we plant in Ontario is grown locally in Ontario. And we have local tollers that we contract with to get bushels produced. And you may be familiar with some of these names. So Parkland Farms at Sarnia, and Robson Brothers and DeVolder Farms. And there's other ones across Ontario and Quebec. But locally for us, it's at these three toller centers where the seed is produced. They work with local customers to grow that seed, and then they treat and package all the seed there at that toller location before the seed is sent out to our local dealers such as Lakeside. So moving on, so SmartStax Pro, just want to have one slide on this, a new introduction that we're pretty excited about. There's been some talk about some resistant corn rootworm out in the province, and we're really excited to offer a brand new trait in the corn side of our business that combines the proven benefits of SmartStax technology that we're used to growing today, plus a unique RNAi-based mode of action. So it'll be the first product on the market with 3 different modes of action for corn rootworm, but it's also built on the success of SmartStax. It also gives us protection from those above ground insects pests. So we are going to be trialing 2 new hybrids in a small amount of plots this year, just to look at the performance from not only yield and disease side of it, but also from controlling corn rootworm. So you'll hear more about that from us throughout the summer and into 2023. We're also excited about the Roundup Ready Extend crop system that we're expanding to include Extend Flex soybeans. So in 2021, growers were given the first opportunity to grow an Extend Flex traded soybeans. We had 1 variety in our DeKalb lineup. And this year we're going to be offering 3 different varieties. And in our plot work this year, we're going to have a variety actually that will fit the maturity that Lakeside customers could grow at that 1.6 maturity, or about 2975 heat units. And the Extend Flex really is built on the success of the Roundup Ready Extend program, and then also offers that option to use Liberty herbicide as an in-crop application to control some of those later germinating weeds. We heard Mike talk about water hemp, how it continues to grow throughout the season, and that's one of the benefits that we see if we can add in another later herbicide applications such as Liberty. So this picture shows the water hemp control that we get with that Extend Flex system. If you look on the left-hand picture here, you can see the untreated check. There's lots of water hemp in there. The middle picture there shows Roundup Extend herbicide put down pre-plant, and then a post-application of WeatherMax, and you can see some of those weeds coming back through. And this really isn't going to hold that water hemp plant from coming through the canopy. And so one of the best recommendations that we found, and I think Mike, you had a good picture on this as well, that included Roundup Extend with Fierce herbicide at pre-emergent, or at that planting time, and then coming in later with a Liberty herbicide at 1 liter per acre. And Liberty is registered up to the R1 stage, so that's early flower in that post-herbicide application timing, and can be quite effective if we get a good sunny day and a hot day. Liberty can be quite effective on those smaller water hemp plants. So just another tool in the toolbox to give us another different mode of action to control some of those tough to kill weeds. And just a quick picture here on Fleabane Control. When we think about the dicamba formulation or dicamba herbicide compared to, say, the 2,4-D in the Enlist program, one of the biggest benefits we see is still that residual component that dicamba offers. This is a picture of the difference in control on Fleabane 56 days after application, and you can see that residual component of dicamba with XtendiMax on the right-hand side is just really, really effective. So with that, I'm going to pass this over to Dave. Do you want to take control, Dave? Do you want me to move the slides for you?
Sure, just move the slides for me, Bob. It's just as easy, I think. So thank you, everyone. So I'm going to talk about 2 new corn herbicides, and I'd say, we've been due for a refresh in our corn herbicide portfolio for some time. So we have a brand new herbicide for corn this spring called Corvus. Corvus, just as a bit of a background, has been within the US market for a number of years, and it's been a very successful product for them. In a nutshell, I would call this an improved version of Converge. So with that, we do share the same group 27 isoxafludol that we see in Converge, also with the same rates that we use. However, instead of using atrazine as our tank mix partner in the package, we've co-formulated it with a group 2, thiocarbazone methyl. So this group 2 actually provides a lot more grass control, also another mode of action, really steps up the performance though of this product. When we look at the timing, this is a little bit unique as well, is that we do have pre-emerge, pre-plant, one thing that's a little bit unique is we do have a pre-plant incorporated label. So you can do a weed and feed with this product. Also can be used up to 2 leaves. So it gives a lot of flexibility on that timing. I think one thing that growers will really like though is the low use rate. We have 3 registered rates, a low rate, which is kind of a setup, a designed 2-pass program, a mid rate, which I think will be fairly common. That's only 133 mils an acre, and then a high rate for those high weed pressure areas. Tank mix partners, quite a few you can add certainly, but atrazine, Roundup, and XtendiMax I think will be our most common ones. Okay. So when we look at broadleaf weed control, and here we're looking at 3 different kind of setup use rates. So when we're using that low rate, like I say, we're looking to come back in within 3-4 weeks. This is about 28 days after. So this is about kind of when you want to get back in there, but we can certainly see a good level of broadleaf control versus our major competitors. When we move to that mid rate, we certainly see that increased level. But I think when we add that atrazine, that is when we really do get a full spectrum, full season control, like you can see on the right on the reddish colored bars. When we look at grass control, and I kind of wish we had the Converge one in this one, because this is when really you see that separation of how much more grass control we do get with Corvus over Converge. But even on the low rates, we're seeing improved grass control. There again, when we get to that higher rate, mid rate plus atrazine, we really have a full spectrum product, which can certainly go the season. So I always say atrazine is a great addition to almost anything in corn, but especially group 27s. Really does help round it out. For those that don't want to stomach the atrazine, you can still go to the high rate and get very similar types of control. Just some photos from this past year. So here on the left-hand side, we have it versus Prime Extra. So here we're looking at Prime Extra. Prime Extra, to my mind, is primarily a great grass product. Not a bad broadleaf product, but you can certainly see a number of ragweeds sneaking through on about 4 or 5 leaf corn, where the Corvus is really doing a great job keeping that clean. Here's another one. So sometimes we do get feedback after the combine goes through, which isn't our way to scout a field, but it happens. You can see on the left, it's integrity plus atrazine. And you can see a lot of skeletons. There's a lot of grass skeletons, I'd say, in there. On that right-hand side, we're Corvus plus atrazine. And I guess this is a good test to show you that longevity of performance that we do have. Really clean, even right to the harvest. So a quick summary on Corvus, a new product, pre-plant incorporated, 1-pass, 2-pass, convenient, and then that it can be used also as 28% as your carrier. And I think it's a great solution for many farmers, as we also are very active on some glyphosate resistant weeds. So I think it's a good package to have a look at this spring. Shifting gears, Lotus. So it's another new corn herbicide we have. So we did get a sneak peek at this one this past year. It's a broad spectrum in-crop corn herbicide. So Lotus is Tembotrione, which is another group's 27. Rapid takedown and residual control of problem weeds. And when we say problem weeds, the one that I want to highlight is water hemp. We're absolutely dynamite when it comes to water hemp, which is a weed that unfortunately continues to spread. We do have a safener as well into this formulation, which helps. As group 27s can, we have seen some bleaching in the past, but this really does minimize that risk. So when we look at efficacy, in that market, Callisto is certainly the biggest product in that post-merge corn market. We can see when we add Lotus plus Lotus plus Weathermax, we certainly got a great takedown on efficacy 7 days after. There again, atrazine does enhance the performance as well. We can see that. And on the right-hand side, this is a little bit longer, so still holding up some good residual weed control 2 weeks after application. So another one here, and this is down by Bothwell, which I believe created the weed, Fleabane. But you can see the untreated check, really, really heavy pressure. Something you would, that would be the 70+ percent loss on yield of those types of environments, probably higher. But you can see Lotus, Roundup, and Atrazine really doing a superb job. And this is certainly some lighter soil as well. So you can see crop safety, but also performance. So in a summary, Lotus is broad spectrum. What I didn't maybe mention is we actually see quite a few grass, is like really good activity in grasses as well. Far more than I thought, far more than I'd say other post-emerge Group 27s have. Rapid takedown and residual control, and I'd say also superior crop safety. So perhaps another product to consider for this coming year.
Okay, thanks, Dave. So we'll switch back over to fungicides now, and I'm going to talk about a new fungicide we're introducing into the lineup this year. There was a tiny bit of it around in 2021, but it's really the first commercial launch for corn and soybeans, and that's Belero Complete. And so Belero Complete is really building on the powerful chemistry that we've had in our Stratego Pro, and it combines the Group 3 and the Group 11 that was in Stratego Pro, as you know it, and has been in the market for quite a number of years now. So we have prothioconazole is at Group 3. It's a fungicide that moves relatively slowly through the plant, but offers that longer residual compared to other Group 3 fungicides. And it's one that you're familiar with in ProLine. Prothioconazole is that product that helps with the molds and ear molds and dawn suppression in corn. The trifloxystrobin, that's really the leaf disease fungicide. Its broad spectrum is very strong on the molds and mildews and rusts and offers some plant health characteristics. And what we've changed with Belero Complete is we just simply added a Group 7 fluopyram. And fluopyram is a fungicide that's used in a number of different fungicides within Bayer crop science. One you may be familiar with is Ilevo, that's used as a seed treatment. But it's a fungicide that's highly plant mobile. It moves fast through the plant, but it also offers that residual protection. It works a little bit differently than other Group 3 modes of action fungicides by disrupting the spore germination of the disease. It also offers that physiological and greening reaction in the plant, leading to a healthier plant throughout the season. It's ideal for high disease pressure situations, very strong on white mold in soybeans, also in edible beans, and it's also been used in a horticultural product, Luna Tranquility, that you may be familiar with if you're in the hort business. And Propulse is a dry bean fungicide that's very, very effective against the white mold as well in dry beans. So if we look at the registered crops for Belero Complete, you're going to hear us talk about it for soybeans, corn, and not so much in cereals, but it is registered in cereals. So if we look at soybeans, the diseases that we're interested in on the soybean side of it, so certainly frog eye leaf spot can be a hit and miss disease in Ontario. Septoria brown spot is the disease I think we see every year, and it's interesting. Belero Complete actually offers some control of Septoria brown spot. That's that yellowing of the bottom leaves of the soybean plant. Phomopsis stem blight, but most importantly, white mold. When we think of spraying fungicides in soybeans, typically it's for overall disease protection, but most importantly, white mold is usually that key disease we're after. If we look at corn, very good on the leaf diseases, rusts, eye spot, northern corn leaf blight, very strong on. Gray leaf spot is a disease we saw a lot of in 2021, and that is on the label for Belero Complete. And more importantly now is tar spot. There's lots of questions, and I got a few slides about that as well. And then in the cereal crop in winter wheat, it can be used for that T1 or T2 timing. Either Belero Complete or Stratego Pro, very, very effective on those early season cereal diseases. If we look at timing of soybeans, just a reminder, if we're basically Belero Complete and Stratego Pro have the same timing on the labels. It is registered up from R1 up to R5, but really the only times we want to use it in soybeans is between R1 and R3. If you're going after a single application timing, which is really that general disease protection timing, probably in that R1 1.5 to R2 timing is the most the most effective timing. If you're targeting a field that has a history of white mold pressure, you have a good, strong plant population and think you have a big, healthy crop coming, and you're targeting for that white mold suppression, we would recommend starting earlier in that R1 to maybe R1.5, and then follow up with a second application 10 to 14 days later. If we look at a 2-year summary here, now this is some of our small plot replicated trial work, comparing Belero Complete to some competitive products, as well as Stratego Pro, comparing those to the untreated check. And you can see here that Belero Complete clearly stands out as the winner in increasing your soybean yields by 4.2 bushels per acre. Switching over to corn, if we look at Belero Complete in the corn crop, and also Stratego Pro, so it's kind of a good pictorial here of the different registered use timings. Stratego Pro and Belero Complete both can be used in those early V stages. It's not a very popular application timing, but with the new onset of tar spot here, we will be looking at that timing. We will be doing some trials this year with some earlier applications. But you could spray Stratego Pro or Belero Complete up to that early tassel timing for leaf disease control. But really, a lot of us in this geography, in close to the Great Lakes Basin with high humidity, we're all concerned about ear molds and dawn suppression. That's where Proline really comes into the factor. And so you look at the on the right-hand side there at that soaking timing or that R1 timing. Proline is registered for all the leaf diseases plus dawn suppression. And then newly labeled application timings on Stratego Pro, we can add the half rate of Proline, 85 mils of Proline to top up that prothioconazole and offer, industry-leading leaf disease protection, as well as ear mold control and dawn suppression in the corn crop. And the same label goes for Belero Complete. So you can use regular rate of Belero Complete plus 85 mils of Proline to get leaf diseases and tar spot and dawn suppression. If we look at a 2-year summary from our field scale trials that we did with our agronomist team across Ontario and Quebec, you can see the benefits of that Belero Complete plus the top up of Proline at the R1 timing, not only from a yield advantage, so 11.4 bushels advantage over the untreated check, but also that dawn suppression. So you can see that red line going down from the untreated compared to the treated side, and that's a suppression of dawn of about 1/3 to 40%, which is typically what we would see by adding in that increased prothioconazole in there. So not only the yield bump, we're looking for protection from tar spot, and then also that dawn suppression. I borrowed a couple of slides with permission from Albert Tenuta here, and this is from some of the work from the Crop Protection Network. And you can see here, this is 2021 trials conducted across the Midwest, as well as Albert's Ontario trials here. And you can see the difference. This is the tar spot severity. So the lower the bar, the better on this chart. You can see the non-treated control on the left-hand side. And then those letters indicate the different and significant difference. And so really you can see on the right-hand side here, Belero Complete and Veltima, a couple of new products that are very, very effective against tar spot control. And some of the other competitive products that were also looked at. A couple of these were only available in the US, are not products available here locally, but Belero Complete certainly standing out there as one of the best. And this is another chart from the Crop Protection Network. Or actually, sorry, this is Albert Tenuta's work and Dave Hooker's work from 2021. And what this shows, it's kind of busy, but this shows, I think there was 14 different fungicide combinations that Dave and Albert analyzed in 2021. The grain yield on the up axis here, and then across the bottom is the ear leaf stroma coverage, or how much tar spot was actually in there. You can see the different products, and just want to direct your eyes to the top left. You can see Belero Complete in there as the highest yield and the lowest ear leaf coverage of tar spots. So that's where you want to be. Albert said in this slide, top left is where you want to be. And it's nice to see Belero Complete, also Belero Plus Proline in that upper left category. So just a quick story here on a field scale trial I had in 2021 with a grower down in southwestern Ontario. This is a split screen of Climate Fieldvue. You can see the application map on the left-hand side with the crosshairs and the untreated check, and then the satellite imagery that we noticed on September 16th. And you can clearly see the low biomass of that crop in those red strips on the satellite imagery. And so I took my drone up. and took a look at this field on September 29th. On the untreated check on the west side of the field, you can clearly see the difference. When we looked at the yield maps and compared, how much impact is this going to have? This was a heavy tar spot infested field. And again, you can see clearly the lighter colored strips on the yield map right in those untreated check strips. And then the benefits of that Belero Complete Plus Proline top up, 31 bushels on the west side of the farm and 24 bushel advantage compared to the untreated check on the middle of the farm. So certainly tar spot can have a big impact on yield response, and certainly Belero Complete is giving us good full season protection. So I'll just finish up with Bracero Pro. Bracero Pro is the next generation of our top selling fungicide in cereals. So Bracero XTR that you're likely familiar with. So just a couple of thoughts on Bracero Pro. So it sets the standard in foliar fungicide protection. It adds a group 7 mode of action along with our other group 3 products that are in Bracero XTR. And it controls all the major leaf diseases from on the flag leaf, things that we're curious about, when we're at that T3 timing, it's going to control those leaf diseases on the flag leaf. But most importantly, this is around fusarium head blight protection and dawn suppression in the wheat crop. And just a couple of slides here on performance. This is 2 years of field scale trials. So it's 23 field scale sites across Ontario and Quebec that our agronomist team looked at. And you can see there basically no significant difference between the Bracero Pro compared to one of our key competitors in the market. About a bushel difference, but really no significant difference there. One thing we did notice consistently was the difference in wheat moisture. And on these same 23 field scale trials, we found 0.7% difference in wheat in moisture at the crop. And Bracero Pro was consistently in line with harvest moisture compared to Bracero XTR or even the untreated check. And we found that Marie-Bacase was just a little bit wetter at harvest. And so that finalizes our portion of the discussion here. We've got lots of new exciting products at Bear Crop Science, and we're certainly feel free to contact your local Lakeside specialist to hear more details on it. And at this point, I'm going to pass it over to Leanne. Carry on.
All right, thanks. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yep.
Perfect. All right. I'm just going to share my screen now. And can you see? Can you see the presentation mode okay?
Looks good.
All right, perfect. All right, I'm just going to talk a little bit about Fieldvue. I know that there is probably some of you on the call that are already using Fieldvue and very familiar with it, but for those of you who are not as familiar with it, I'll just touch on a few points. And so you saw Bob give one example there of the Belero Complete trial and the untreated check. So, if nothing else, I think, the imagery is a great place to start and get your fields mapped, and you start using it to look at the imagery and be able to, just see what you can learn that way. But in essence, here's what Fieldvue is all about. You can get all of your data in one place really easily, whether you've got multiple pieces or multiple brands of equipment on the farm or all one brand. If you've got, memory cards or yield cards, thumb drives. You can import any historical data into Fieldvue. If you don't have any technology on your equipment, you can still enter your data manually, and you've got it all in one place so that it's, you know, at your fingertips anytime that you're going out to a field or someone's asking you questions about what you've done in that field. So it, you know, kind of replaces the pen and paper if you don't have the technology on your equipment. But if you've got technology, it can really help you uncover a lot of insights on your farm. So once you've got all your data in one place, you can then use that data in a much better way to make really informed operating decisions on your farm, whether that's in season, learning from new products or hybrids or varieties that you've got on the farm, different management practices. You can learn so much when you've got all of that visualized within that field. And you can also use that for making future decisions in the next seasons. And then you also have your historical data there, so you can look back to see how did that field yield in past years, or, you know, where were those problem areas. And so on top of that, you can then optimize your inputs. So we've got a couple of different scripting tools within Fieldvue. So going back to, you know, Dave kicked off the meeting talking about the scripting that they do, and he mentioned Fieldvue there. There's ways to very quickly and easily create scripts on your farm, even if you don't have yield maps. So you've got imagery that we can use, or a combination of imagery and yield maps to do seed scripts, which I know some of you on this call have used before as well. So just to give a visual here in CAB, so if you do have the opportunity to hook up your equipment, you can use this, the Fieldvue Drive, which is this little contraption here that just plugs into your diagnostic port, or if you have a 2020 monitor, then it just plugs right into the back of your monitor to feed into Fieldvue. So Fieldvue is a data reader essentially. So you need something in your cab to collect that data, and then it's getting fed into Fieldvue, so it's all in one place. And then from here, you can see that there's the split screen, so you can look at the hybrid and the population at the same time and visualize what's happening in the field as you go across the field. And the nice thing is that it also offers the opportunity for anyone else within your operation to see what's going on in the field as well. And any of your Lakeside rep or any agronomist that you work with can also see this information if you choose to share those fields with them. So it's a really nice way to offer transparency of what's going on in the field to help make better decisions on your farm. And so when it comes to scouting in season, you know, listening to Mike talk about monitoring your weeds and keeping an eye on the weeds that are controlled and what's maybe not being controlled, you've got all this field information at your fingertips. And here's an example here where you can see you've got your notes here. There was some wireworm in 2019. You've got your planting date, population, your hybrids, any of your applications that have been mapped in Fieldvue will show up here, and then your harvest data as well. And so then again, you can split the screen and look at any two layers at one time. You can go back to previous years to see, you know, was that red area there the last time it was in corn, or has it gotten bigger or smaller? And then even when it comes to things like T3 timing in wheat, maybe this is a different wheat variety and it's really showing up. So you know that you can't just pop into the corner there to check for the, you know, the stage of the wheat in that field. You also need to come over here and take a look there, and maybe there's a different timing for that part of the field, or you adjust the timing to compensate for the variability within that field. And as I mentioned, it's really easy to share the information from your field with others, and, you know, if they're all part of the operation, everybody can access the data really easily. And then when it comes to pin dropping and sharing those pins, I'll show you some examples of that. And it's just so nice to be able to, you've always got your phone on you, and you can access this information right from your phone at any time. So I like to say, if you can operate a smartphone, then you'll be able to use Fieldvue. It is so easy to navigate through and to use that, you know, if you are intimidated by technology, it's worth giving this a shot because it is so user friendly, and just, you know, start small, start somewhere, and then you can kind of grow into it. So here's an image of what you can see from the Black Fieldvue app, where you can look at, you get an overview of all of your fields. And so this is the scouting imagery. We also have the vegetation imagery that you can look at, but this gives a snapshot of each field and the variability within that field. So for something like Bob showed you this example of Belero Complete, and you know, things like that really stand out and get you wanting to check out what's going on in the field and seeing what you can learn, or sending somebody out to see what's going on, what's causing that to happen. Or you've got images like this where there's a big red blob maybe that hasn't been there before. Maybe there's some standing water and you want to see, you know, is it actually standing water? Is it dried up before sending an applicator out to the field, or is it a soil issue, or what's going on? And you can track how that changes across the season and across the years. And here's just some examples of what the pins look like. So, you know, sometimes the dark green, like Dave was talking about, the dark green means higher biomass. Usually that's a good thing, but sometimes that's just a heavy weed patch. So maybe you're going across the field and you recognize weeds that shouldn't be there. You can drop a pin, snap a picture, and then you can actually text this or email this pin to your Lakeside rep to just confirm that it is what you think it is, or to help figure out why those weeds are there and when they shouldn't be there. And so that will go to their, you know, it'll be texted to them, and then they can actually open that up right in Google Maps. It'll drop a pin right in that spot in the field. So whether you're sharing that field with them or not, they can go right to that field and right to that spot in the field that you were looking at. You can also mark it as a permanent. So say it's a wireworm issue and you want to monitor it next year when it's in soybeans, you can mark it as permanent and it's going to show up next year right from the beginning, and you can continue to monitor it and manage it as needed. If you're one who likes to do on-farm trials, if you are using Fieldvue, it's going to make you want to do more and more trials, which is great because you can learn from them, and you don't need to worry about stakes or flags. Or if you do want to put stakes or flags in, you can drop a pin, and then it makes them a lot easier to find once the crop has grown up over top of the flags. If you can't get a weigh wagon and it's time to take it off, it's not a problem because you've got it all tracked in Fieldvue, and you can, you know, as long as you've got a yield monitor on your combine, you can take a look at those yields after the fact. And then there's always the plots that get combined through because the combine operator didn't know there was a plot there or it got forgotten about. And you don't have to worry about that because if you've got it all mapped in Fieldvue, you can just go back and take a look at it later. It doesn't matter if the plots are big or small, simple or complex, or even those unintended trials, or some people call them mistakes. It's a great way to learn from those mistakes that happen, whether it's you know, you run out of fertilizer or it gets plugged up. You can go and take a look and see what that impact was on yield. And so I love this example. There's a lot going on in this field. We've got a hybrid plot down at the bottom of the field, but there's also headlands are mapped separately. So what can you learn about the headlands, and maybe you're going to manage those differently. There's no starter strips. There's some Invita here. So there is a bunch of custom hybrids here because then, so here's the yield map here, and you can see there's a lower yielding area as well. But then at harvest time, you can just draw a circle around that field and see how each of those treatments did. So you can see the headlands here, which make up 20% of the field. It's 19 acres and almost 100-acre field. Those headlands are yielding 23 bushels below the field average. So maybe that's something to consider when you're looking at planning for next year. You look at the no starter treatment and how it compares to the starter areas, and then, you know, Invita, or fill in the blank, whatever the product is that you're testing. It's an easy way to compare that. And then you can go one step further and you can just put a circle around that lower yield potential area And maybe you gain some new insights on maybe the Envita has a higher yield response. I think in this case it did in the lower yielding area than the higher yielding area. So it helps with positioning and some of these new products that we're still learning about and seeing, you know, where do we put these to get the biggest bang for our buck. So quite often you end up with more questions than answers, and then you're trying different things next year, but it's such an easy way to sort through all of that information. And so Bayer value, or Bayer, if you're enrolled in Bayer value, then Fieldvue is free to you. You get a free subscription, and which makes it even easier to just use, you know, one part of it just to get started and get your feet underneath you with Fieldvue. Or if you're you know, embracing technology and you love technology, you can connect all your equipment and dive right in. So because it is free, you can, you know, take it at whatever pace works best for you. And then any hardware, so the Fieldvue drive, and there's some adapter cables available on the Fieldvue website that you can get at 50% off, and Lakeside will have your this discount for you as well, but it will take 50% off at checkout if you're ordering it on the website. Not all of the hardware is available on the Climate Fieldvue website, but any that is, you can get that discount there for this year. So I like to say, you know, set some goals. What do you want to learn this year? And then, you know, when you're looking at Climate Fieldvue, especially when you're just starting out, you know, what do you want to accomplish? And then, you know, work your way through the season, and you'll probably find that, you know, as you work through the season, you'll start using it more because it is easy, as I mentioned, to navigate through. And then after harvest, check back on your goal. What did you learn? And then what do you want to learn for next year? So every crop season is an opportunity. You get, you know, one shot a year to figure things out. So I think this really helps you progress quickly within your operation, and it also you can gain a lot of efficiencies when you're using it on your farm. And our Fieldvue website has a lot of information on it if you want to learn more. We also, if you Google Fieldvue Cab Chats, there's some great grower interviews and how they use Fieldvue, what they like about it. So those could be interesting if you're wanting to hear from other farmers that use it. And we do have a workshop tomorrow, actually, at the 4 Points in London. If you're not signed up yet and you're interested in going to it, then just let your Lakeside rep know, or my information is there, or Bob or Dave can also get you a link to register for that. And that is all I got. If there's any questions, I can take them now.
Awesome. Well, thank you for that, Dave, Bob, and Leanne. We'll just check through the chat here. And it doesn't look like anyone has any questions at the moment. So we will continue to move on to our fourth and final speaker. Next is Aaron Stavanis. Aaron is the technical sales manager for the Mosaic company, whose products include K-Mag, Mez, and Simtrax. Today, he's going to be chatting about how these products can bring high yields to your farm.
Perfect. Thank you, Anita. Just let me share my screen here. Can you see that all right? Perfect. Awesome. Well, thank you. I guess I'm the last speaker, so got to keep it lively. Hope you have a cup of coffee and got your bio break in between. As Anita mentioned, I'm Aaron Stavanis, technical sales manager with the Mosaic company. I cover Eastern Canada, and I'm here today to talk to you just about balanced crop nutrition. We're going to spend a bit of time at the beginning talking about, first off, who Mosaic is and a little bit about our mining operations, and then from there go into talking about balanced crop nutrition and the importance of looking at nutrients beyond nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. And then we're going to share. I'm going to share a little bit of yield information with you as well. If you're not following me on Twitter, here's my Twitter information, also my contact information as well. So before, sorry, getting a little excited here. Before we go any further, I figured I'd give a little introduction to myself. Some of you may know who I am and may not. So I'm Aaron Svanis, come from a family farm in Bloomingdale, Ontario, which is just outside of Kitchener-Waterloo. And we are looking to take over our farm this June. So we're moving back to the farm and really excited to do that. I'll be the 4th generation on that farm, and my 2 children, the top of the screen here, if they choose to do so, they'll be the 5th. So really excited about that. We do mixed cropping. So we do biggest acres would be pumpkin, squash, potatoes, sweet corn. And then we do a little bit of everything else. My parents used to do a CSA that they delivered right into Kitchener-Waterloo. Now we focus on our on-farm market and partner with the virtual farmers market and restaurants within the Kitchener-Waterloo area. I'm very kind of obsessed. People talk about hobbies and you know, some people have cars as a hobby, or mine's technology and agriculture. So precision ag is a passion of mine. I've probably got the most tricked out 7,000 John Deere planter with precision plant technology on it. So I've got multi-hybrid variable rate on the seeding boxes, and then variable rate fertility as well. This is a picture here. And before, in my previous career, I was in the seed industry, and I was looking at how does essentially the seed hybrids and hybrid types fit into precision ag. And now being in fertility, I focus that in on how does fertility work in precision ag. And Dave did a great job at the beginning of the meeting discussing that and what Lakeside has for opportunities in that. And I do think it's very important when we're talking about 4Rs, and specifically the growing area that you all live in, being so close to Lake Erie. I graduated from the University of Guelph in 2003 as a diploma student, and then 2007 as a degree. Spent some time in retail and the seed business, and now I'm here with Mosaic. So who is Mosaic? I'm sure you've heard lots about them because fertility is a hot topic right now. But in general, why do I come to work every day is our mission statement of helping the world grow the food it needs. And I'm going to go a little bit more in depth than that in a couple slides, but that's essentially our mission statement. And how do we do that? It's essentially by providing phosphate and potassium products, and beyond that, with secondary macro and micronutrients as well, to essentially help grow as much food as we can as our finite resource of land continues to decrease. So I promised a picture of essentially, or an idea of what a mining operation looks like. So, you know, we do produce potassium. It is produced it's mined in Florida, and we have production plants across the US. And this is the big, essentially, matrix drag line that takes that matrix. So phosphate is an old fish bones, essentially. That's the base of rock phosphate. And then we go through a process of essentially separating that rock phosphate from the other particles within the soil, piling it, and then it goes through a chemistry process to make monoammonium phosphate, diammonium phosphate, or microessentials, as said. Our potash business is here in Canada, and after this, I'm going to show you a little video of our new mine, our K3 mine in Saskatchewan, which we're really excited about. And this is all underground. So, you know, mile underground, we have rotors that we're going to see in the video as well. And then it takes it away in a conveyor. And then we go through a granulation process to essentially make it the potash that you're used to. So that's muriate of potash. We have a white granular, which is Pegasus, which is a 62% potash. We have a Spire, which is a 0058% potassium with 0.5% of boron. And then K-Mag is specifically in Carlsbad, New Mexico. That ore body is the only place in the world where you'll find that, where it's a blend. The natural ore body is a blend of potassium, sulfur, and magnesium. So I'm going to play you a video here. Hopefully this works. I'm going to switch from my pointer. And I'm going to try to voice over a little bit of what you're seeing. So in general, our K3 mine is the most technological advanced potash mine in the world. And it's very autonomous. You're going to see pictures of our 4 rotors, but this specifically is our 2 overland conveyors. And they're taking ore body from our K3 mine, which you see here. That's our tower, to our K1 and 2 mines, mills. And those conveyors are over 12 kilometers long. These towers, they're the highest buildings between Winnipeg and Calgary. And there are 2 hoists that are bringing over ore body from 3,100 feet below the surface. And currently our K3, hoisting record is just over 62,000 short tons in 24-hour period. So that's how much ore is coming up. These are our new 4-rotor mining machines. And we have a fleet of 9, and there's a 10th one coming online. So when we build these, they're built underground because they are so big. And that's what you saw previously in the video. And this is just them speccing out that automation with the miner. And here's what potash looks like coming right out of the, that's mined right out of the ground. So that's what it looks like before it goes through the granulation process. And obviously lots of automation goes into producing muriate of potash. So that's it for a brief, quick trip to Saskatchewan virtually. But it is very interesting to see how much goes into production of fertilizer. And specifically, that's for us here in Canada, and very proud that our potash and Aspire is made here in Canada. Dave wanted me to just quick talk about distribution of fertilizer globally. So to put this into perspective, when you look at fertility and you look at this global map, so the USA, they use about 10% of the global phosphate. They're 10% of the global phosphate demand. So if you we don't really have stats on Canada, but if you say you throw Canada in that, North America, let's say, we're at, say, 15%, to take a shot in the dark. So 15% of the demand or need in global supply of fertilizer comes from North America, and the rest gets shipped across the world. If it's from North America being produced, or if it's from produced in China or Russia or Brazil, it's getting shipped all the way around the world. And a part of that too is efficiencies, in the sense of growing seasons are different all the way around the world. So interestingly enough, if you look at our potassium, the top importers are Brazil, China, India, and then Brazil and India for phosphate as well. So it's a global market that's constantly in demand, and really lately it's been a fire of demand. For an example, in South Asia, palm oil has gone through the roof, and so it heavily depends on potassium. So there's a major demand for fertilizer in the world right now. And a part of that is because in general, 60% of our yield depends on soil fertility. So when you think about that, from like Tice Tolinar talks about that theoretical yield of corn. So say that whatever, it's 500 bushels, it's probably above that now with our genetic potential that we have. It continues to increase as we have better traits and better varieties. But think of that genetic potential, and what happens is things start coming off that genetic potential, either by environment, by pests, by management. So, planting too wet, tilling too wet, not having your planter set up properly. All these things take off. Well, 60% of that is for soil fertility. So making sure you have your soil balanced is very important when it comes to final yield. And that's why, to echo Dave's point on that soil testing is important and the gold standard to make sure that you're putting the right fertility on. But when we're talking about that fertility, what are we talking about? What's an essential crop nutrient? Well, with the definition of an essential crop nutrient are these 17 nutrients you'll see here in this periodical table. So we look at them as 4 different categories: primary macronutrients, secondary macronutrients, micronutrients, and non-mineral elements. So if we kind of break those down into different silos or buckets, we start with primary macronutrients, which we all know: NPK, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, needed in large amounts to essentially sustain a crop and maximize its genetic potential all the way through to the season. That's followed by a secondary macronutrient, so needed just a little bit less than a primary. So that's what, a step down from a primary macronutrient, and those consist of magnesium, sulfur, and calcium. And then finally, looking at micronutrients, from that, essentially what we can provide in fertility. And those are things that we need in very small amounts. And they can be challenging because they can move from a deficient to a sufficient to a toxic level very quickly because they're needed in such small amounts. So we need to be mindful of that. But those micronutrient elements are boron, chlorine, manganese, iron, nickel, copper, zinc, and molybdenum. Sorry, it's always a mouthful. I always say it wrong, but yeah. So those are ones you need in small amounts. Finally, I guess this is the true finally, is these non-mineral elements. And in general, we get these from nature. They are the building blocks of life. We are all carbon-based entities, and so therefore hydrogen, carbon, and oxygen is that building block. In general, we get them from the environment. If you are applying manures or compost, some type of soil amendment, then you are applying carbon and probably some hydrogen and oxygen as well. But you can assume you get these from the environment. And really what it all comes down to is really focusing in on this Leibnig's law of the minimum. We've seen this so many times. It seems to be in the fertility side of things. You can't talk about fertility without Leibnig's law. And really what that is, as a refresher, is each stave is essentially a crop nutrient, and the water in the barrel or the wine in the barrel is your max yield potential. So in this example, we have sulfur. It is the lowest stave, so it's the most limiting factor for yield. So our yield is limited and can only be maxed out to this stave. So once again, driving home, soil testing is important so we can correct these staves. And also understanding, working with your agronomist and people at Lakeside to essentially know the principles and what's limiting, like Dave talked about with what percent saturation or what nutrients are available based on the chemistry in your soil. And so what I'm going to do is quickly just focus on these micronutrients, because they are a little bit more challenging than those primary macros and secondary macronutrients. And how do we essentially derive good fertility and good utilization of that investment in micronutrients? And Ross Bender, who used to be my crop nutrition lead and now moved up the ladder to director of new product development, he came up with these 3 Ds of micronutrient management. And he said, these are the 3 things you need to really focus on to really drive home that maximizing micronutrients and making sure, once again, those staves in the barrel are maximized to maximize yield potential. And that comes down to these 3 things: is distribution, duration of availability, and daily use. So to go in those a little further, distribution, once again, because you go from essentially deficient, sufficient to toxic very easily and very fluidly, distributing that micronutrients, since you're putting such a small amount on, is important. So making sure that every plant has a good day by having a source of micronutrients to it. Then it's the duration of availability and daily use. And we're going to talk about those a little bit more in depth as well. But really looking at, is that nutrient available all the way through the growing season, especially as we start to increase more biomass, talking about, the satellite imagery you already heard about earlier, talking about when we're maximizing that biomass. Same thing, we're going to need as much nutrients into the plant when we're maximizing that biomass, because it needs it, because it's sufficing not only vegetative growth, but it's also putting it into a sink of the grain that we harvest. So when you look at it from an importance side of things, 60% is the most important, and that goes to distribution. If we can't distribute that micronutrient properly, we're going to run into some troubles. We're going to have toxic, deficient, and sufficient all within the same field. And then evenly split 20-20, even if you put them together as 40, because they are fairly similar, is that duration of availability and daily use. So if we break this down into a little bit more, tangible, something you can think about, touch and feel, let's look at this distribution model. So Mosaic, we like to talk in the US, they like to talk about football, big football fans. They use a Mosaic stadium because we do support the Rough Riders, the CFL, but I figured let's make this a Canadian thing. New crop nutrition lead Taylor Prucker and I came up with this distribution in an acre of hockey rinks. So 2.5 hockey rinks is the equivalent of 1 acre. And if you think of 5 quarters equaling an ounce, to make 1 pound of micronutrient, that's going to take 80 quarters. And of those 80 quarters, it just so happens that a roll of quarters is 40. So think of it as if you take 2 rolls of quarters, and just for simplicity factor, let's take 1 roll of quarters for this hockey rink and run a roll of quarters for this other hockey rink and just spread them across the field. I mean, the ice rink. Think of that distribution. How many quarters are going to be well distributed across each of these 2 hockey rinks? That doesn't even include this half. That's just these 2. We're really not, if you take that back to the field, then we're really not providing a good distribution of micronutrients throughout the field. And you're going to have, once again, plants that are deficient, sufficient, and toxic. So it's very important to make sure we're essentially covering all of the whole rink for good distribution and making sure those plants don't have a bad day. So then when we look at that other slice of the pie, so that 40%, so 20 and 20, but of duration of availability and daily use. Now we want to take a look at the resources of Ross Bender's graphs that he worked on with Dr. Fred Below for his doctorate. And that's essentially when the plant is taking up micronutrients and how much. So if you look at these graphs, on the x-axis is growth stage or time. And on the 2 y-axis is percent of total uptake of this nutrient. And then how many ounces, because it's a micronutrient, so they're talking ounces. Unfortunately, it's not metric, so we're gonna have to deal with the ounces. It's how many ounces of boron is taken up during the time period. And so we have this for soybeans and corn. I'm gonna focus on soybeans. I'll make a couple comments on corn. But in general, when you look at this, there's a couple things. So we talk about that, obviously, this slope of the curve. So looking at boron specifically at R2, that's when we really start our drastic uptake of boron. And technically R2, we've only taken up 20% of the boron that the plant needs. It's taking up rapidly all the way to R8. The other thing you can look at is in these graphs is where it's called partitioning. So that's why they're called nutrient uptake and partitioning. We have different colors. So that's essentially different parts of the plant. So for soybeans, it's green is the leaf, yellow is the stem and petiole, red is the flower and pod, and blue is the grain. And then the vice versa on corn, leaf blade, stalk and leaf sheath, tassel and cob and husk, and then the grain. So when you see a straight line like this, that means that we're not getting any partitioning. So we're not robbing Peter to pay Paul within the plant. Some of them, you'll see them dip down later in the season, and that's essentially saying we're moving nutrients out of the leaves and into the grain to finish that grain. But with boron, that doesn't happen. These are straight. So what that means is it's immobile within the plant. It needs to be taken up by the roots. This changes with fruit and veg crops, specifically fruit crops. There is some sugars that help flow movement of boron, but in general in row crops, it's a fairly flat line. It's only taken up through the roots. We do see this dip in corn right at VT, and there's some argument there on why that happens. Argumentally, there could be some essentially in the pollen that's changing this, but in general, it's the same. You see there's no partitioning within the plant. So once again, it's the importance of having that. How much do you need during the growing season? Are you providing enough of it to make sure that later in the season, when we have this drastic uptake, we're getting a season-long availability of micronutrient, in this case, boron, and are we meeting that daily use? So as you can see, as we increase biomass, daily use keeps increasing. So very important. Once again, why they kind of combine together to be that 40%. So when you look at tools to say maybe address this balanced crop nutrition, Mosaic does have a portfolio of products, Micro Essentials or MES, which is a homogeneous granule of nitrogen, phosphorus, sulfur, and zinc. And of that sulfur is 2 forms of sulfur, sulfate sulfur and elemental sulfur for season-long availability of sulfur and uniform distribution of zinc. We have K-Mag Premium, which, as I mentioned earlier, it is nature's trifecta of nutrients of potassium, magnesium, and sulfur, and it's a 21.5% potassium, 10 magnesium, and 21 sulfur, and that literally comes out of the ground as that ore body. It gets diluted a little bit in our granulation process because it is premium, and so we get these nice prills because we just add a corn binder to it. And finally, Aspire, as I mentioned earlier, is our potassium-based product with 0.5% of boron. And of that 0.5%, it's split 50-50 with calcium borate and sodium borate for season-long availability of boron. So when you look at essentially these three products together, of that, say we had the 17 essential crop nutrients, we take off the hydrogen, carbon, and oxygen for 14. So of that 14, 7 nutrients are provided with these products. And once again, to kind of reinforce what Dave talked about, pH is, when it comes to fertility, your first dime is spent on lime. I like that term, and it's true. I mean, and he covered that well. You know, phosphorus specifically can have some serious tie up with too low of pH and too high of a pH between aluminum and calcium. So once again, driving home that importance of soil sampling and making sure that you're reading your soil test properly, and talking with your crop input representative from Lakeside to make sure that you're coming up with a plan and executing that plan moving into the spring. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time quickly on essentially our products and some quick yield advantages for them. And really when it comes down to is I want to show you these AgriFacts are essentially our summary of all the small plot research trials we do. Mosaic doesn't do any of their own research. It's all third-party universities. So we have Dr. Mike McLaughlin at the University of Adelaide, where he talks about essentially the biochemistry and chemistry level, how also how fertilizers are created, and the granulars, how well they are essentially made and sustain their quality. Then we have Dr. Ismail Çekmek from the University of Sabancı in Turkey, and most of the time, if you look in a fertility textbook, you'll see his name. He is kind of the guru when it comes to plant soil interactions in the world, and he does all of our greenhouse grow outs. So anything that you see a root or grown in a pot, he does that. So it's looking at that soil chemistry interaction and seeing how plants take up nutrition. And then finally, Dr. Fred Bilo does all our small scale in-field trials. So you can see it's like a stepping stone of moving closer and closer to the field. So long story short, these AgriFacts that you'll see that I'm referencing are the summary of those, and they have to be at least 2 years with multiple locations to be able to find that. And you can find them on our website. From anyone at Lakeside, we can make sure that you have access to these if you'd like. So long story short, what are we looking at in this specific trial? And that's essentially that response to zinc. So once again, moving back to talking about that distribution model and how important it is. So if we look at our x-axis here on pounds of actual zinc in a blend, and our yield here on the y-axis, our treatments are the different colors. So we have these gray diamonds. That's the MAP ammonium sulfate zinc sulfate blend. And then this yellow one at the top is microessentials, as I said. So as we ratchet up our pounds of actual zinc in the blend, you can see that the plant does respond very well to zinc. And especially when you think of corn, we're really going to get a real good advantage because of what zinc helps to do. So it helps to bring phosphate into the plant. In cool, wet soils, it helps root proliferation on top of the phosphate. And when we're looking at specifically row crops, where we really focus on mycorrhizal infection on the root to bring in more zinc, half of our zinc comes in mycorrhizal infection. It's really important to make sure we have that good distribution of zinc, so it's bringing in more zinc to the plant as well. So once again, really good response to zinc. But when you do that distribution model, so when you look at 2 pounds of actual zinc now being applied through microessentials, which is 200 pounds of product in this for 2 pounds of zinc, now we're equivalent yield to 10 pounds of actual zinc in a blend. So once again, a 3 times efficiency by just having that distribution of zinc solved. Once again, focusing on that 60% that Ross talked about, also focusing in on the daily use and duration of availability as well. So that's the benefit of having a well-distributed nutrient through microessentials. Then I'm going to look at, so we're going to have 2 of the exact same trial setups. This is for K-Mag. And what we're looking at is essentially taking our potassium source and taking a little bit of it out and replacing it with some sulfur and magnesium. So we're going to look at our treatments on the x-axis here, and obviously yield is still on the y-axis. And we're looking at our control, which is just nitrogen and phosphorus. All of these will be balanced for the nitrogen phosphorus. So that's our standard of 204.8 bushels per acre. So now what happens when we add muriated potash to that? So adding 60 pounds, so 100 pounds of product of muriated potash. Now we're getting about just under a 4 bushel yield advantage by adding potassium. And we know that. I mean, potassium is a major part of corn fertility, especially when you talk about stalk strength. Low potash testing soils usually have less stalk strength, so making sure your potassium levels are up is very important, especially for late season intactness in corn, and also major contributor to soybeans as well. So we know, very important. Now let's take out that little bit of potassium. So now we got 50 pounds of K2O brought to you with muriated potash, and then 10 pounds of K2O with K-Mag. So this equals about 50 pounds of product of K-Mag. So just that little addition has now brought us a 5.6 bushel per acre advantage over this blend. So a really nice increase by just adding that little bit of magnesium and sulfur. I know in general, I know across the trading area of Lakeside that you can have low mag soils, high mag soils. There's a big difference, but really what it comes down to is providing that plant available source of both magnesium and sulfur really helps to kick in for yield. So then when we look at that exact same plot setup, and now we're just switching it to soybeans, now we see, once again, that nice incremental response. So we do see an increase just over a bushel, 1.3 bushels by adding that muriated potash. And actually even some of the trials that we did with horse bonner, we were even more. We were getting up to a 4.4 bushel advantage with Aspire over the control, and even higher when the soil tests were lower. So we're really seeing, once again, this is on the average across several sites across Canada, Ontario, and the US states. We saw 1.3 bushel advantage for muriated potash. Then when we added, same thing, 50 pounds of K-Mag and replaced that little bit from the muriated potash, then we saw a 2.2 bushel advantage over the muriated potash alone and a 3.5 advantage over the control of no potassium. So once again, driving home the importance of potassium and having that more balanced crop nutrition of making sure that you're not limiting a stave of, say, a secondary macronutrient, in this case with magnesium and sulfur. So finally, going to kind of wrap up the K-Mag with this little precision ag trial I did on my own farm. Like I said, I'm obsessed, and I thought it would fit in well based on kind of what Dave was talking about with precision ag. And so what I did was I did a comparison of essentially micro essentials plus K-Mag with a MAP ammonium sulfate blend, and we just didn't have the and no zinc. It was just MAP ammonium sulfate balanced to P2O5 and sulfur, and wanted to see what essentially that magnesium was doing in the blend with K-Mag, and also the distribution of zinc. I will say in general, my soil test levels are high. My magnesium is at that 140 to 150 parts per million, and mag solubility can be higher. I'm really focusing more on potassium because my K to mag ratio is a bit out. But what I wanted to see was, supplying a soluble form of magnesium. Can we get some yield responses? So we set up in a grid pattern. You can see different rates, and the red is, different rates, and then the clear blocks here, I apologize for being smaller, is where we have an untreated check. We were essentially going to do just this section of the field, but I continued the script on, and I'm glad I did, because in this year we had a drought. So this is very sandy soil, very sandy loam soil. As you can see, this is kind of skewing our results. So in keeping this, we kind of had a better distribution within the field. So what we saw was essentially a 4.9. Now this is just one site, one location. But what's really cool with precision ag is you can take this field's only 10 acres, and you can take a small section or even bigger section and get a lot of data points. All of these bars in the piano graph are essentially from different rates of fertility in these different blocks. And so then I was able to average them out and look at what our best return on investment was, for which rate was the best return. And it was right in that 150 pounds per acre in the 2x2. This was planted with my corn planter. I doubled back to do 15-inch rows. I'm a sucker for research, so I obviously spend too much time on that. But really looking at that 150 pounds per acre as our best return at 4.9 bushels. And then what I did was I mapped this in Fieldvue. I applied my Aspire at different rates across the field. And luckily enough, I did map this at 100 pounds throughout the field, and that essentially gave us the best result and just the most data points. So once again, it's the caution we need to have in precision ag is understanding what everything means. We see as this application rate goes up, the yield goes down in Aspire. That's what this is. But that is mostly because a lot of our applications were in this kind of tougher yield zone. The majority of our 100 pounds per acre was in this good area here and here. So we got a 3.4 bushel advantage with 100 pounds per acre of Aspire broadcasted on top. So these are the kind of cool things that you can do as we move into technology and have this ability to map products, and you can see essentially what works best on your field, because every soil is different. Once again, I'm going to plug again, soil testing, especially with higher fertility prices, is super important to make sure you're maximizing and capitalizing on your ROI. So this is my kind of last and final slide when it comes to just showing results. And that's a neat just crop rotation. So it's really looking at not from just a 1 year over 1 year comparison, but looking at a more systems approach to balance crop nutrition. And so what they did in this study is they took a rotation of soybeans, sorghum, soybeans, and corn, and they applied MAP alone, so just phosphate, and then they addition of potassium, so MAP plus muriate of potash, and then we replace that with microessentials, as said, in Aspire. So really what we're looking at here is addition of potassium, and then more of a balanced crop nutrition approach. Now we have 2 forms of sulfur and zinc, and then 2 forms of boron. And so what we see here is I won't spend a lot of time focusing on the yield. What I want to look at is as the percentage increase, because it's kind of a little bit easier to show. So when we look in year 1, you'd say that doesn't pay. 0.7% increase, essentially no statistical difference. If you're taking that based on year 1, there would be no results, and it's not a management practice you would take in. But let's move into the next. I should mention too that all of the cropping practices, so what the rates they applied were based on the rates for each crop. So they're not the same rate across each crop. It's based on whatever the crop removal or the needs were for each crop. So moving into sorghum, which we don't grow, maybe we grow it for a cover crop, but now we start to see these yields start to split out. So now we get a 3.8 percent advantage by adding that potassium. So once again, we're starting to build the soil. In general, it's different for each type of fertility, but you can always figure, utilizing 60 to 70% of your applied nutrients in that year, and then it's going to bank for some of the next year. And so that's why, that build up and maintain that Dave talked about earlier is important if you're trying to build up your soil test. So we can see we're banking on a little bit extra of that potassium here. And now we're actually seeing this increase of 9.9, almost 10% with microessentials and Aspire. I'm going to talk about that a little bit later once we roll through everything. But into year 2, so back to soybeans. Now we're looking at 11.8% increase by adding that potassium. So our soil test, and actually, it's not in the AgriFact, but we did see soil tests start to build as we continued on. And then once again, splitting away from the pack here again with the microessentials and Aspire at 16.1%. And finally, in the last year, so what we're looking at as corn, adding that potassium, now we're seeing 18%. And with the microessentials, as said, and Aspire, a 41.1% advantage in corn. So really, looking at it, the take home is this. We add that potassium, stop focusing on just phosphate. We're seeing a nice incremental increase in yield because that's what the demand for the plant is, especially even if you compare like soybeans. Sure, they could be different growing seasons, but look at that. No response to an 11.8% response. It's pretty telling. And then when we look essentially at here with our blend of balanced crop nutrition, so really looking at essentially that what's providing the balance. So not just NPK, providing the balance to what the crop needs, and we're raising up those staves, maximizing our genetic yield potential from what place that fertilizer has. The other neat factor is because of the elemental sulfur portion of microessentials and the calcium borate section side of the boron from Aspire, we actually did see soil tests start to build, which is pretty neat. But once again, it's looking at that continual application and obviously filling the staves in the barrel to maximize yield. So to summarize, kind of went through everything quickly. I wanted to make sure that we stayed on time, and looks like we're going to do that. And I just want to do some final take-home messages. So crop nutrition, first off, is mostly beyond, it's got to be beyond NPK, especially at the yields we're achieving right now. We've got to start really focusing and managing our crops even more than we have before. Every good recommendation starts with the soil test. Once again, it's really focused on with higher fertility right now, but it still should be, no matter what, a really focused in and laser focus on soil testing and making your recommendations off that. That's how you're going to know where your staves are in the barrel. Increasing your nutrient efficiency with homogenized fertilizer granules. I'm going to challenge you, if you're not looking at microessentials specifically, I think it's something you should look at, because we are providing, a more balance of crop nutrition, but also, driving home extra yields in that increase as well. And that 60% of the yield comes from soil fertility. And that's not just fertilizer, that's the bank that you have in your soil. I'm going to hit it again. Soil testing is important because that is a part of that 60%. It's that bank that you've already invested in or that's in your soil, and we want to sustain that. And then finally, create a plan with your Lakeside crop input representative and execute that plan in the spring. I know it's always hard and things change, but spend a lot of time, especially when we're looking at that 4R side of things, really make sure you try to execute that plan and walk together with your crop representative or input representative at Lakeside. So that's it for me. Thank you. Here's my contact information again. You can follow me on Twitter. Mosaic has a great, they're spending more time on this now at their crop nutrition. That's also our website for all fertility information is cropnutrition.com. So if you just want to know anything about crop fertility, there's tons there of information there. If you want to watch our transition of our farm as we move on to the farm, start to take over, we are on Instagram at Stevana's Farm, and actually really cool. I showed you that video of that K3 mine, but really cool pictures and stuff on Mosaic in Canada on their Instagram account. Lots of things coming from that mine as it should come into full production here in Q2 of 2022. So I will stop sharing my screen and pass it back.
Yeah, great presentation, Aaron. Appreciate it. So guys, just to wrap up, we're going to say thanks to everyone on the call and thanks to all of our speakers. If you take a picture of this with your cell phone, it will link you to an option to sign up for a monthly newsletter. So I'll leave that up on the screen for a little while, and yeah, have a great one. We'll talk soon.